Okay, now wait. Okay, trasmetti, and we are going live. We are live now.
Okay. Hello, I warmly welcome you to our 45th webinar by the Academy of Space Renaissance International. My name is Sabine Heinz, and I'm one of the vice president and responsible for our webinar series. And on this 17th of July, I'm really delighted that you have come to join us. We have people watching from Las Vegas, from Portugal. Hi, Alfonso. And yeah, from Germany, from Italy. And our today's special guest is Michelle Hanlon. Hello, Michelle.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Yes, we are really glad to have you here. She is co-director of the Air and Space Law program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and at Center of Air and Space Law. And our today's topic is recognizing and protecting the history of humans in space. Very, very important topic. And I also would like to welcome Adriano Ottino. He's also a vice president of the Space Renaissance International and our former president and one of the founders of SRI. Welcome, Adriano.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Welcome to you and welcome, Michelle. Very curious to listen to your presentation this night. Okay.
Michelle, before I give you the floor, I would like to introduce you to our audience. Michelle Hanlon is co-director of the Air and Space Law program at the University of Mississippi School of Law, as I told you, and at Center of Air and Space Law. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Space Law, the world's oldest law journal dedicated to the legal problems arising out of human activities in outer space, and its sister publication, the Journal of Drone Law and Policy. Michelle is a co-founder and president for All Moonkind Incorporation, a non-profit corporation that is the only organization in the world focused on protecting human cultural heritage in outer space. And in this capacity, she was instrumental in the development of the recently enacted One Small Step Act in the United States. For All Moonkind has been recognized by the United Nations as a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adriano, Sabrina. This is such an honor to be here. What you guys, the way you promote space and an understanding of space and all we do and all we get from space is just so important. And I'm so glad that you all do that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So there you have it.
Yes.
So I, as was mentioned, I am the co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, and I'm talking to you today sort of with that preservation hat on. I'm a space lawyer, but my passion is thinking about how we will promote the sustainable use and exploration of space. And I and my colleagues at For All Moonkind very, very firmly believe that the way to start is by looking to history and protecting our history in space and the kinship and kindred spirit that history should hopefully brew amongst all of us. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about the history. I know many of you probably know all of this already, but I think it's always nice to see pictures of stuff that's in space. You know, some people actually don't realize that the very first human-made object to impact another celestial body was not an Apollo object. It was by the Soviet Union. This was Luna 2. It impacted, unfortunately, it was a hard landing. It crash landed on the moon on September 12, 1959. I know that date because that's the date my parents got married. So I always remember their wedding anniversary because I remember this. But it's interesting because the Soviet Union sent with this the spacecraft this sphere that you see, this ball, and it was of medallions all put together. that say the name of the country, CCCP, and the date on it. And the idea was that when the spacecraft Luna 2 impacted the moon, the medallions would spread out all around it. And so it's a really interesting concept when we think of it from a legal standpoint, right? What does it mean? So in 1959, we don't have the Outer Space Treaty or any law with respect to space activities in space yet. All we know in 1959 is that we have created a custom because, of course, the Soviet Union beat the United States also in this race to space by putting Sputnik in orbit, by creating an object that orbited the Earth before any other country did that. So it's a very interesting time. And when the Soviet Union very victoriously was able to orbit the Earth, President Eisenhower in the United States made a very strong and important strategic decision. He said, okay, we're not going to object, even though we know that that spacecraft, Sputnik, overflew our territory in space. We're not going to object to that. And so let me take you back and think about aviation, right? We know from 2 world wars that you cannot fly over somebody's country in their airspace. If you do, you will get shot down, or the country will have every right to shoot you down. Airspace is part of sovereign territory. You cannot cross that. It's as if you have an invisible border going all the way up into the sky. But what we didn't know was what would happen in space. Do those borders go all the way up as far as the eye can, into the heavens? And that was the old Roman law, right? That you owned your property down to hell and all the way to the heavens. But when the Soviet Union orbited the Earth, President Eisenhower took the lead and said, we're not going to object because we believe that there should not be any borders in space. We believe that this overflight should be acceptable and legal under international law. And we have then instant customary international law because other nations followed the United States lead or came to their own conclusion themselves that, yes, we will permit this. We won't object to this overflight because we want space to be free and accessible to all. So it's interesting because as we learned from history, the Soviet Union was rather taken aback by that position because the Soviet Union did want to have its borders extend into the heavens. And so when it sent Sputnik around, didn't really think about the repercussions from a legal standpoint. And so then they get to the moon first and they have these medallions, and you have to wonder, they intentionally said this wasn't a plaque that was going to sit there. It was intended to explode and spread out. And so you have to wonder what they thought would be the implication of having those medallions spread out. As we know, Luna 2 crash landed. The impact was so hard, it probably vaporized all of these medallions. But certainly the Soviet Union had no real position to be able to state, oh, well, we have something and therefore we have some claim to the moon. The Soviet Union had many more firsts on the moon. The Luna 9 pictured here, the vertical spacecraft there, was the very first soft landing on the moon. So that impacted the moon and was able to take pictures of the moon and send them back. So the Soviet Union had the very first pictures of the moon. Again, very interesting. Although the Soviet Union sent this spacecraft to the moon, it landed softly and it sent the telemetry back to Earth. It was intercepted by the UK and the United States, and so the UK and the US actually had the first physical pictures of the moon that they could see before the Soviet Union did, because they were able to intercept and then analyze that material. The Soviet Union also had the first wheels on the moon. This is a lunar. And so although the United States ultimately had the first wheels driven by humans on the moon, the very first wheel tracks on the moon were made by the Soviet Union and this lunar. Again, another, and I'm going to do this all day, so get used to it because history is so fascinating. Another really interesting thing, lunar 2 was actually bought by U.S. citizen Richard Garriott. I think he's a UK U.S. citizen. But the Soviet Union went through a period where it was trying to raise money, and it sold a lot of its artifacts. And this particular artifact is on the moon. Richard Garriott's never held it, never seen it personally, but he owns it, and he has made an argument that because he owns it, He owns the territory underneath it, and he owns the rover tracks that it's made. Now, he makes those claims somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but this just sort of shows you where we are with respect to the law of the ownership and of property and of territory in space, that it's muddled. We don't really know. We have no concept. We have an outer space treaty that I'll talk about that says you can't own property in space, but what does that really mean? It doesn't actually, I take that back. I'm a lawyer, I should be more precise. It doesn't say you can't own property in space. It says a state may not claim territory in space. But anyway, a fun fact of history, that this lunicod is owned by a private individual. Prior to the hard landings of Bereshit and Space IL, this was the only hardware on the moon owned by a private individual. Of course, Apollo 11, we have our very first footsteps on the moon, our very first bootprints, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin acting for all humankind. And this, of course, is one of the world's greatest technological achievements. But when we think about our history on the moon, I want you to, put your human hat on and think not just about the technology and about these engineering marvels and all of this hardware that's on the moon. I want you to remember that we sent humans to the moon, and even the things that didn't go with humans, even these robots and other hardware, we all sent human stuff with that. So when we talk about Apollo 11, sure, we talk about Tranquility Base, and we talk about the LEM, the Eagle, and the flag, which is likely knocked down. I think we even have Buzz Aldrin saying that he recollects seeing the flag being knocked down when the LEM took off, the ascent vehicle took off from the LEM. But we took a lot of other stuff with us. So the United States formally included an olive branch, a little gold olive branch to place on the moon, and the United States formally included messages of peace from more than 70 nations that were sent, on paper and then inscribed on this disc the size of a US $50. So some very sentimental things also sent to the moon. But then Neil and Buzz, our first two humans on the moon, had an opportunity to bring things that they wanted to bring. And what was their human reaction to what they brought? They brought this patch from Apollo 1 that memorializes the 3 astronauts who perished in the United States. They also brought medallions memorializing the 2 Russian cosmonauts that had passed away in this space race, in this effort to meet the heavens. So remember that when we go as humans, sure, there's a huge technological achievement. But remember, too, that humans are creatures of culture. And we have this sort of indelible desire to be remembered and to make sure that our presence is somehow memorialized. So, for example, in Pompeii, we see graffiti, things like, John was here, left in the ruins of Pompeii. This is what humans do. We crave to be remembered. We crave to have some sort of substantive memory of ourselves and our achievements as individuals, and hopefully as a human race. So I'll just go quickly through the Apollo missions because they're the most human-centric. Apollo 12, this is a really interesting story. This is a ceramic tile, and on it is artwork from some of the great artists of the time, of the 60s. So think Andy Warhol, Rauschenberg. And rumor has it that this little tile was affixed to the side of the lunar module while it was being prepared for flight. Now, this is not on the official records of NASA, and therefore, if it is actually there, somebody violated the law and put it there without telling NASA. There's actually a whole TV special on is the artwork there or not. If it is, this is the very first artwork on the moon, our very first moon museum. But of course, if it is, and nobody has fessed up, nobody has admitted that they put it there, if it is, we won't know either until someone relays that information on their deathbed when they have no fear of being persecuted by NASA, or when we go back to see if it's there on our own. Apollo 14, another very human event. is the first time that anybody ever shanked a golf ball on the moon. And so for those of you who don't play golf, I don't, but I understand shank means you didn't do a very good job of hitting the golf ball. And of course, in very low gravity, you can imagine how difficult that was, especially when you consider he didn't actually have a real golf club. But 2 golf balls were shanked onto the moon. And people always ask me, oh, should we protect the golf balls? I mean, they're just golf balls. Well, I don't know. My job isn't to decide what to protect and what not to protect. My job is to make you ask that question, to think about what do we need to protect? What does it say about humanity that we took golf balls to the moon and took the time to try and hit them as far as we could in this low gravity atmosphere. Apollo 15 were the first wheels driven by humans on the moon. And again, this particular experiment that was undertaken by Apollo 15 is very near and dear to me because I'm not an engineer or a physicist, and I actually had a lot of difficulty with calculus. But this, understanding how things work in a vacuum, I never actually witnessed it, but now you can go on YouTube and you can see the drop of a hammer and the drop of a feather, and you can see them hit the ground, hit the regolith at the same time. So that feather and that hammer are still on the moon. Again, showing that human curiosity, that human want to understand physical reality and to witness it ourselves. Apollo 15 also took this, it's called the Fallen Astronaut Memorial. You see this little figure, little astronaut, and then this plaque with the names of all of the astronauts and cosmonauts, again, who had perished up until the time of the launch of Apollo 15 in the human quest to reach the stars. Apollo 16, of course, probably the most human reaction of all, right? Charlie Duke left a photograph of his family on the moon. He traveled to the moon with this picture of his loved ones, and in memorial to them, in celebration of them, in celebration of his humanness, he left that photograph on the moon. Now, this is really a poignant story. We also have the story of Neil Armstrong. Of course, his daughter passed away long before he got to the moon. It is understood that he took his daughter's locket to the moon, and the question of whether he left the locket, the little bracelet there or not, is another one of those sort of enduring mysteries of the moon. He has never said whether he left it or not, and actually even his author, his biographer, Jim Hansen, asked him point blank, and he didn't answer. So we have no idea. But we do know that Charlie Duke's photo is on the moon, and I want you to think about that because it was an unusual opportunity for Charlie Duke to take the photograph of his family and place it lovingly on the moon. Granted, again, radiation, it's probably all white, and you can't tell what it is anymore. But you know what? Now everyone on Earth has the opportunity to send a photo to the moon for the right price. Through a number of companies. The one that comes to mind, on top of mind, is Robotic with their DHL box. For a modest sum of money, you can send whatever you want to the moon. And that worries me because I am a proponent of sustainable space exploration. If everybody on Earth were to send a picture to the moon, there would be 7 billion pictures on the moon. And that doesn't seem very sustainable to me. So the question is though, well, if Charlie Duke can leave a photo on the moon, why can't I? And so these are really, that may seem very trivial, but this is what, when we think about law, this is what we need to think about, is not, okay, one is okay. We need to think about the eventuality of 100 years from now, what it's going to look like, what is going to be the repercussions of the laws that we make today. So, again, I'm a proponent of permissiveness and flexibility, but sustainability and responsibility. And finding that balance is very difficult. Of course, Apollo 17 was the last crewed mission to the moon. They left behind a lot of equipment, but basically, when we think about the culmination of the Apollo program, we have pictures, we have Bibles, we have cameras, we have messages of peace, we have all sorts of very human things and very technical things left behind and pristine. There's no weather on the moon. There's no other visitors to the moon. Nobody's picking things up or carving their names and initials on things. And so all of those things are pristine on the moon and in a very good state to be protected and preserved. So again, of course, I don't forget that all of these missions to the moon, whether they had people or not in them, had people involved in building them, and things were sent with them as well. When you think about firsts on the moon, you have to think about Yutu-2 and Chang'e-4, the first mission to successfully soft land on the far side and start exploring the far side of the moon. On that mission, they made lettuce, right? This is the other picture is of a Ranger spacecraft. And in this one, with this spacecraft, the United States, or NASA, sent ashes of Eugene Shoemaker. So again, I want you to take a step back and think about that. How wonderful, how poignant. He was an incredible scientist, contributed so much to our understanding of the solar system and planets. And so how fitting that some of his ashes would be on the moon. Okay, but now, you know what? There's a company, anybody can send their ashes to the moon. And again, we've accepted that you can send ashes to the moon. Is this something we want to accept? If everybody who dies were to send their ashes to the moon, again, that's not sustainable. I love this picture of Surveyor 3 because this is actually bears witness to our very first archaeological expedition to the moon. Apollo 12 landed 300 feet from Surveyor 3, and the astronauts actually brought pieces of Surveyor 3 back to Earth with them. And it was really interesting because that is how we first started understanding how deleterious the plume effect can be. And so the plume effect is when you land or cause some sort of combustive force, propulsive force on the regolith of the moon, because that regolith is not packed down. There's not a lot of gravity, and because it's a pretty thick layer, you can see the footprints sort of indenting in, but because of the low gravity, they're not indenting as much, and so you actually get 5 to 12 inches of poofing. And because there's no weather on the moon to soften the regolith, it's very hard. And so when something lands and creates that propulsive effect, it's like sandblasting something 300 feet away. And so we learned a very important lesson by going back to the Surveyor 3, that this regolith can be very damaging. And that's one of the things that we're struggling with right now, or I should say we should be struggling with as an international community, as we're all looking to go back to the moon and specifically looking at the South Pole. We have Chandrayaan-3 headed there now, Luna 25 going at the middle of August, US and China all planning missions to the South Pole. That plume effect is something we have to take into consideration in terms of understanding how we're going to interfere with each other, even inadvertently. So this is when I say there's no weather on the moon, there's no erosion on the moon. This was taken by the lunar orbiter. You can see everything that we've done on the moon. This is phenomenal. Where else in time have we been able to look and say, look, we can see our footsteps. We can see the Challenger, the descent stage, the flag, our equipment, our rover tracks. This is what it looks like on the moon right now. It's pristine. This is such an unusual set of circumstances, and we cannot afford to protect, observe, memorialize, and at very least recognize these incredible footsteps for what they are, an incredible achievement. Because those footsteps don't just memorialize the men who landed on the moon, they memorialized the 400,000 Americans who worked on the Apollo mission, right? And this is a picture of my good friend Ron Creel. He was an engineer working on the lunar roving vehicle. He comes and talks to my class once a year, and every time he comes, he just sort of kicks himself because he thinks that he somehow could have done a better job helping those rovers deal with the plume effect and that regolith. Of course, gifted gifted engineer. But what is also amazing is the awe in which he holds the Apollo astronauts, because I don't think we understand well enough today just how risky and incredible and brave those particular humans were. But those sites don't just memorialize 400,000 Americans, right? Those sites on the moon, whether it's Chang'e, Luna, Apollo, Ranger, Surveyor, they memorialize our entire history of humanity. We have been looking up at the moon for millennia. We have had dreamers and astronomers and storytellers and physicists and scientists all looking and wanting to understand and to reach the stars. So those bootprints on the moon come not just from 400,000 Americans, but from the entirety of human history. So what do I mean by that? So these are footprints in Laetoli, Tanzania. They represent probably they represent the oldest recording we have of when humans decided, one of our common ancestors, decided, I'm going to stand up on 2 feet. I'm not going to walk around on all fours anymore. And why is that important? Well, what happens when you stand up on 2 feet? You free your hands, right? And what can you do when your hands are free? You can carry things. You can touch things lovingly. You can make tools. You can start to communicate. So we don't get to the moon unless our common ancestor, somewhere in Laetoli, Tanzania, or before, these are estimated to be about 3.3 million years old, these footsteps, decided to stand up on 2 feet. We do not get to the moon unless we have our hands free to make tools. So all of human history is filled with these kinds of milestones. The way we learned how to harness and make fire instead of running from it in fear. The way we learned how to build boats and strike out across the oceans and overcoming our primal fear of open water. Learning how to draw. The drawing is the precursor to communication, to verbal communication, to writing. But you know what else it is? Think about the graffiti in Pompeii. Think about leaving a picture of your family on the moon. This is humanity. This is humans saying, hey, don't forget me. I was here, and I went on these hunts, or I observed these animals, or I observed the stars. Don't forget me. Don't forget my story. We don't get to the moon without those people. We don't get to the moon without somebody in the Congo picking up a baboon bone and starting to make hash marks on it. What does that baboon bone show? It shows the beginning of math. We don't get to the moon without math. And also, we don't get to the moon without somebody probably in Mesopotamia looking at sand and saying, you know what? If I heat this up a lot, I bet I can make something transparent and beautiful, but also glass. We don't get to the moon without glass. And so you see this progression. When we think about those bootprints on the moon, when we think about all of those missions, Luna, Chang'e, Apollo, none of those happen without the entirety of our human history and our human evolution. Every single society and culture on Earth has contributed in some way to those technological achievements on the moon. We recognize well on Earth the importance of protecting heritage and the role it plays in human kinship and peace. Around the time that the United States and the Soviet Union were in this race to space, Egypt was developing its economy. And Egypt said, oh, wow, okay, we need to harness the Nile River because we are never going to build an economy that is based on the whims of this river flooding whenever it wants. So we need to build a dam, the Aswan High Dam. And so when Egypt spec'd that out, it realized that building that dam would flood the Nubia Valley. The Nubia Valley is considered one of the cradles of human civilization. And so Egypt thought, wow, okay, we want to develop, but we're going to flood these temples. What should we do? So Egypt didn't just say, oh, we're going to stay in our little corner of the world and just going to do what we want to do, right? No, Egypt went to the international community and Egypt said, look, we are in a bind. We need to do this to develop our economy. We shouldn't be left behind. But we also understand that we are stewards for all of humanity with respect to these treasures in the Nubia Valley. Help us, what should we do? The international community didn't say, oh, who cares, Egypt, go ahead. And the international community didn't say, no, you cannot develop, you must figure something else out. The international community came together and said, okay, we are going to help you. We're going to move those temples out of the Nubia Valley piece by piece. The international community raised $80 million and in the 1960s figured out the engineering to move these piece by piece. So think about that. They didn't say, oh, that's an Egypt problem. It was understood to be humanity's problem. We needed to protect our human culture heritage, wherever it is. We learned from this. We raised $80 million, and this was the birth of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. This understanding that protecting heritage, recognizing heritage as human achievements is one way to rebuild, should I say, that kinship among humans. And so today, because of the World Heritage Convention, we have these two incredible human achievements, standing up on 2 feet, freeing our hands for us to evolve in ways that our ancestors could never have imagined, and our first step on another celestial body. Only one of these is protected. So preservation is a compelling idea that can help unite people rather than divide them. It's an idea that can help build a sense of community among people throughout the world. And this is true, but it's so much more than that, okay? When we think about heritage, we need to think about, again, our humanness. And the best parallel we have is to the Polynesian migrations, right? So what we see in Polynesia is where we are. The parallels are amazing. So if you are standing on an island deep in the South Pacific, South Seas here, right? And you look out, you are not going to see another island. You are not going to see another rock, another person, another civilization. All you're going to see is the endless ocean, and then you're going to see it meet the heavens. So if you are standing on an island as a Polynesian and you're looking out, you have no idea where you're sailing to. You probably think you are going to sail into the stars, right? That's where we are today. We have so much more knowledge, but we are on this threshold where we are looking up at those stars. We have no idea what we're going to find there. But what did the Polynesians do? They didn't stop and say, oh, okay, we are going to stay on our island and we're going to do better at conserving our resources on this island. No, they said, there's something else out there. We're going to go and we're going to find it. I might not be able to see anything besides those stars. I don't even know what those bright lights are, but I'm going to build a boat and I'm going to go and find it. And so when they built these boats and they went off across the ocean, and I also want to point out, when we think about the Polynesian migration through the South Pacific, you know, we recently had a very tragic event with the death of a number of explorers in the Titan submarine at Ocean Gate, right? How many Polynesians do you think died trying to find another island? We have no record of them, of course, because they didn't have the internet. They didn't have cameras. We have no idea how many people have died in this human quest of satisfying curiosity, of finding what's on the other side of the mountain, of finding what's across the ocean. So remember that when we think about people who are risking their lives to do things like go into space, even for 5 seconds, 30 seconds, however long those suborbital flights are. This is what we do, and people are going to die doing it, but that is part of the humanness. And of course, there are people, nobody's forcing you to do it. So, you know, if you don't want to take the risk, you don't have to. Anyway, I digress. The point is, they went across the oceans, and a lot of them made it. But you know what they did? They didn't forget their culture and their traditions. They brought their culture with them, and they brought their traditions, and they brought this. Why? Because it builds that sense of community. They belong to something. They remember something. They're remembering their ancestors. This is what it means to be human. And not only that, they brought their traditions and their understanding and their knowledge of culture. So when we think about the Polynesians, I want you to think about Easter Island, because one of the one of the theories about Easter Island is it is one of the furthest most that the Polynesians were able to make it, but they didn't pay attention to their traditions, to the teachings of their elders, and they completely deforested the island, which is why they all died. Their civilization did not survive because they didn't hold on to their traditions and cultures. It's an extreme example, but of course you get the point. This is why it is so important to protect our heritage. Of course, the Polynesians also built boats, and I use this because the hubris of the Western European explorers to show up in Polynesian communities and sort of poo-poo the fact that they could have made it across the ocean with their primitive quote unquote boats. But imagine if they had worked together, right? Imagine if instead of Western ideas and Polynesian ideas, they took the best of both and worked together. Maybe the advancement of humans throughout the world would have gone a little bit differently, a little more swiftly. A lot of problems with the way humans expanded throughout the world, but let's take the good lessons that we can out of it. So that we celebrate that this is what John F. Kennedy said, talking about UNESCO and the Aswan High Dam. We celebrate the past to awaken the future, because looking back at what we've done, understanding how far we've come, understanding this human need to be remembered, is what must awaken our path to the future. And that is what is going to put the guardrails on that path to make sure it's sustainable and responsible. So what do we have in place with respect to the law? So I've gotten through, hopefully I've convinced you, we have to protect our heritage in outer space, any heritage found beyond Earth. We do have a outer space legal regime. It is made up of 4 widely ratified international treaties. I call this section Mind the Gap because these treaties were negotiated in the 1950s and 60s at a time when we weren't even thinking about doing what we're doing right now in space. We had no idea that we were going to harness space resources we probably had a smidging of an idea that we would be using it, but we thought, for spying, and so not for weather prediction. We thought we would maybe use it to communicate between militaries, not so that we could all go on TikTok. So thinking about the way we used space and how we thought we were going to use space back in the 1960s versus the Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1967 versus what we're actually doing today. So there's a lot of gaps in the law because, first of all, we had no idea. Second of all, these were negotiated during the Cold War. So the most important thing to do was try to keep the peace in space. And I had a third point and I just lost it. But, here we are. There are a lot of gaps. I'm going to talk about the Outer Space Treaty. That's our Magna Carta of space law. Very important thing to remember about the Outer Space Treaty, it's a binding and enforceable treaty, no question about it. It is guidelines and principles governing activities of states in outer space. So again, think about a Magna Carta, just a very sort of high level, aspirational kind of thing. The fundamental precept of the Outer Space Treaty is found in Article 1, exploration and use of space shall be carried out for the benefit and interests of all countries and shall be the province of all humankind. I can lecture for hours on what does province of all humankind mean and talk about what it's not the same language used in the law. It's not the same language used in the Antarctic Treaty. It's not the same language used. It's something different, but that doesn't affect sort of the concept of heritage protection. Article 2 says outer space is not subject to national appropriation by means of use or occupation or by any other means. Okay, so Article 1 and 2, right there, you see the problem, right? If I want to protect Chang'e 4 site, if I want to protect the Luna 9 site, it's appropriating somehow, right? It's saying don't go here. Article 1 also says that there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. Well, it's not free access if I've told you you can't get too close to the Apollo 11 site, right? So the very fact of saying we want to treat these sites differently violates this concept of free exploration and use and non-appropriation. Activities must be carried out in accordance with international law. I point that out because we also have the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Article 17 says humans have a right to own property. So that seems to conflict with Article 2, that you can't. It's not subject to national appropriation. Again, a lot of conflict in the between lawyers about what all that means. And so when I opened and I talked about what does it mean when Richard Garriott owns this piece of metal on the moon? What else does he own? Does he, that whole concept of property needs to be explored at length by the international community. Article 6 says you have to have, every country is responsible for the activities of its nationals. This is very important because under public international law here on Earth, the state is not liable or responsible unless the state had a role in what was going on, that somebody was acting as an agent of the state. So I use this example. If I go to Canada and I I'm trying to think of a heritage site in Canada. I'll go with the usual. I go to a gas station and steal all their candy bars. I come running back to the United States. The United States has an extradition treaty with Canada, and so will send me back to Canada to, for justice. But and that's it. That's the end of the U.S. responsibility. If that same thing happens on the moon, then not only does the United States have to sort of send me to Canada to face justice, the United States has to pay Canada back for those candy bars. That's what that means, that international responsibility. So there's an extra level of state responsibility, state liability for actions in space, which is a good news for heritage protection or liability, because it doesn't matter if you're national. If we pass the laws we want to pass and we make it against international law to damage one of these heritage sites, then each nation is responsible. So a lot of people will say, well, you talked about the World Heritage Convention and it works so well with with Egypt. Why don't we just extend the World Heritage Convention to space? Well, the World Heritage Convention relies on states to nominate heritage sites within their territories, right? That is how you do it. You as a state will say, oh, I would like the Liberty Bell here in the United States to be considered a World Heritage site. And then it will be considered by the international community. Well, the United States can't say, please, would you consider making the Tranquility Base a World Heritage site? Because then that's the United States saying, hey, this is in our territory. That's a violation of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. So you see how this is sort of gets complex and difficult. There's another provision of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 9, and it states that you will implement your activities in space with due regard for the corresponding interests of other states parties. So what does that mean? I don't know how many lawyers there are listening in, but for non-lawyers, I think due regard has, pretty good idea that it's, being courteous, being mindful, respectful. Under the law, it's a balancing provision. Due regard is also used in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's been arbitrated once. The tribunal declined to find a universal rule of conduct. And said, we're going to balance. You're going to look at what were the nature of the rights that were violated by the first state, why were they violated, what was the extent of the impairment, and what was the nature of the other activities. So I call this provision the lawyer's cha-ching provision, right? Because look at those words. If there's any lawyers out there, you know as well as I do, we can argue this for decades. We can keep appealing and appealing this decision, and we can get all sorts of money tied up in paying legal fees. That's not what we want. But on top of all of that, what does it mean to have due regard for a non-operative piece of junk that's on the moon, that happens to be the piece of junk that took the first humans to the moon, but it has no monetary value? What is the liability if you knock over the LEM, the Eagle? The United States can't say we've lost this stream of income, so there's just no way to determine what the loss is. So what have we done at For All Mankind? Well, we have been working since 2018 within the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and I'm American, so I've been working with the U.S. legislature. In 2019, we introduced the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage in Space Act. Yes, it took that long to pass. It passed the Senate unanimously in 2019 on the anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, which is coming up soon, the 54th anniversary, very soon. Imagine 54 years ago, there were three men in a little tin can wondering what was going to happen when they got to the moon. And it was passed into law in 2020, signed on December 31st, 2020 by then President Trump. The NASA issued guidelines. NASA understood, oh, people are going back to the moon. We have to worry. What can happen to these sites? And so NASA said, look, taking this concept of due regard, although they don't talk about it in their guidelines, they say, hey, if you're going back to the moon, we would be really grateful if you would just pay attention to the hardware that's up there, and avoid getting too close to it. And so it actually implements proposed safety zones around some of the American sites. So the One Small Step Act, those guidelines promulgated in 2011 are not binding. They're not enforceable. They're just recommendations. So when we drafted the One Small Step Act, we sought to make those guidelines binding on all U.S. nationals. It would be part of the licensing process. You cannot go to the moon unless you agree to abide by the NASA guidelines. That is what was passed in the Senate. It was weakened considerably in the House. The law now says if you are contracting with NASA, then you will abide by the NASA guidelines. So right now, today, that's fine because it has the same effect because all the U.S. companies thinking of going to the moon are contracting with NASA. But you can see how that will quickly not be true anymore. And of course, it doesn't bind any non-U.S. people. But it is it's the first time any national legislation has ever recognized that we actually have cultural heritage in outer space. We were also, Gabriel Swinney and Michael will very kindly say that, our advocacy did affect the negotiation of the Artemis Accords. I will say that every time I saw Gabriel Swinney anywhere at any time in the world, I would say, hey, Gabriel, hey, protecting heritage, what about it? What about it? So I am the consummate squeaky wheel. But as a result, we have Section 9 of the Artemis Accords. So now we have 27 signatories to the Artemis Accords. So we have 27 countries that agree through Section 9 that there are historically significant human and robotic landing sites, artifacts, and spacecraft, and that we need to preserve them. Of course, we're talking about mutually developed standards and practices. We haven't seen a lot of movement on that yet, but I think people are talking about other things right now. But this is what we've done with the Artemis Accords. Again, we have 27 signatories, and hopefully that will continue to grow. We're also working with a couple select countries to, I shouldn't say select, we're working with a couple of countries whose citizens have indicated an interest and trying to get passage of national laws, much like the One Small Step Act. And so again, sort of looking beyond U.S. borders to try and build international accord without needing to have a multilateral arrangement. So if you are not a US citizen and you are interested in advocating for the protection of heritage through your national government, I would be delighted to talk to you. So why is it important? Okay, what do we know? We know that we are going back to the moon. There are more than 30 missions, I think, planned right now for the next decade, right? And where are they all going? They are all going to the South Pole, because that is where we have what we think we have abundant water. That is where we have the peaks of eternal light. So we can work 90% of the time that we're there. We don't have to worry about going dark and getting cold. So this area of the moon is going to get very crowded. Well, what do we have to worry about? Well, sure, we can stay out of each other's way, but what about that plume effect? And how far apart do we have to be from each other to protect each other's equipment? What level of risk should we be working for when we think about what we're building to operate on the moon? So we need safety zones. And what do we want to do with those safety zones? Well, safety zones are sort of like a precursor of this concept of property, right? And we've moved into this era in humanity where we think about property as a thing that you can exclude people from. It is mine. You cannot come in. This is mine. Don't touch, right? And it's mine to exploit. So we have this whole concept of exploitation and keep out and exclusivity. Well, let's turn that on its head. Let's make the very first safety zones about protecting heritage. So the very first safety zones that we institute multilaterally off our Earth is not about exclusion and mine. It's about kinship and protection. It's about conservation, not about exploitation. If we look to the one thing we can agree on, 193 nations have executed and ratified the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. We know on Earth how important it is to protect heritage. There's not a nation that can say, no, we don't agree, right? So that is the basis for agreement in space. And that is the basis for agreement on the level of kinship, again, rather than competition in space. We are also working as we're considering right now, this is Snoopy, which is still orbiting the moon. And so one of the things we're considering is making Snoopy or petitioning to have Snoopy put on the US National Heritage List. And why would we do that? Again, it would be a way of recognizing of the US federal government, recognizing that we have cultural heritage in space. And this is not on the moon. This is an object in space, and we know from the Outer Space Treaty that once you move an object into space, you don't lose your jurisdiction and control over it. And so it would be another first step towards recognizing and building a tradition of recognizing, protecting, and preserving human cultural heritage in outer space. In 1993, journalist J.G. Ballard speculated that Neil Armstrong may well be the only human being of our time remembered 50,000 years from now. I think we owe it to them to protect his bootprint. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this interesting lecture. It was really amazing. And you have to come back. I have decided you have to come back.
Anytime, anytime.
Anytime. I also would like to welcome Bernard Foyne, our president, with short hair, like the temperature is requiring.
Yes,
Hello, Bernard.
Yes, it was great to listen to your talk. Yes, I was just traveling last week. We had a field school in Vulcano and Etna, and the heat was so high that I had to leave my hair as heritage. Yes, so now I am in Spain in the Astronaut.
But you look younger. You look younger. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I will do something like that in a couple of days.
And today I was in the Astroland. This is an interplanetary agency that is based here in Spain, in Santander. And they are doing a number of simulations, and we are collaborating with them. So clearly, we are very interested in preserving heritage and our humanity. And so, yes, I want really to thank Michel for this very interesting talk with a historical and humanistic perspective, which is, of course, very dear to the heart of Space Renaissance International. And of course, I have a question of how you mentioned the way to make it international. So you were very effective on the US side. Then you have mentioned, okay, maybe the Artemis Agreement as a way also to get some of the partners involved. But is there also a route through the United Nations? Or you mentioned UNESCO, cultural heritage. So it would be just very simple to declare, for instance, the moon is a continent of the Earth, and then we would apply similar rules than the preservation of the UNESCO sites.
You make it sound, Bernard, so simple. We'll just call the moon the eighth continent. Nobody would disagree with that. Yeah. I think so. First of all, if you don't follow Bernard on Facebook, you should, because his travels are amazing. And so it's always fun to take a peek at what you do. And thank you for all that you do as well. The idea that, and we have the concept here on Earth of World Heritage towns, right? The entire towns and cities have been considered World Heritage sites. We have approached UNESCO, and UNESCO has not wanted to get involved because there's enough issue here on Earth with infighting about where some sites are. You know, already people argue on Earth. No, you can't claim that as a World Heritage Site because it's in our territory. And so the idea was that they would rather wait and see what happens. But that said, you know, there are several different branches of UNESCO, of the World Heritage ecosystem, that are all sort of looking around and toying with this idea. So we already know within UNESCO there is a whole arm that's focused on heritage of astronomy and space sciences. So that's an incredible first step. So we have this area where already on Earth we're identifying sites that have helped us get to space. And there are people also considering underwater heritage. Heritage in jurisdictions that are beyond national jurisdiction underwater. And so we can possibly borrow some of those ideas because space is beyond national jurisdiction. It's the same idea. The way I describe For All Mankind is that we're not operating, we weren't the first people to come up with this idea. We're not operating in a vacuum. We have wonderful allies all around the world, but we are the loudest and squeakiest wheel you will ever hear. We will not stop until that heritage is protected.
Yeah, so
excellent. Bon courage. Thank you.
Excellent. I find interesting what you mentioned at the beginning, because it's true that every human is asking themselves, what can I leave, or what can I leave that they know that I was here? Yeah, and you have family trees, and writer has his books, and musician has music like Mozart or Beethoven. What is world heritage too, or painters like Picasso or other famous painters. And I would like to take the questions from the chat. I also would like to welcome people from Norway, from Gilbert Phoenix from Norway, Kame Musika, maybe you know him. He's
Yes.
sending greetings. I don't know where he comes from.
Thanks for joining. He's from Poland, so.
I'm from Poland, so we have people from Poland, and Westfers is here. So we have many people here. So I will start with the questions from the chat. Ena Larsen is asking, isn't it sustainable enough that we all know or should know that expansion into space is the most important tool to protect the entire planet and all life as we know it?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I don't think enough people on Earth realize that yet. And so, the job of any space enthusiast is to be a space advocate. And so I would encourage everybody, and hi, Wes, thanks for joining. Wes is an incredible advocate of space, Wes Fairs, is to talk about space and talk about how important it is. We have this great opportunity in September with the UN Science Summit in New York. Where we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know SRI is going to be there, but it gives us an opportunity to share with the world why we can't be sustainable on Earth without space. And so I know SRI is proposing an 18th SDG, which I applaud. There is not enough understanding at a public level. Right now, we still have a very sort of small percentage of society that is involved in space. And so one of the things that we are really focused on doing at From Unkind is building out that base of understanding. And at that point, I think we need to stop, put an end to the questions of why are we looking up there when we have so many problems down here? Because that's just a silly question.
I totally agree with you. Camille is asking, is it possible that future space law would take a more area-based approach, not base provisions on artificial space objects? Basically, zone-based, not object-based, Article 8 and 9 OST.
Thanks, Smith. Yes, I think we do have to stop thinking about space as a legal regime and think about space as a place. And so as far as zoning goes, I haven't thought out that far, but one thing I will say is I think the moon is someplace special. And I think a lot of people on Earth think the moon is someplace special. So when we talk about space governance and space law, I do think we need to zone the moon differently from an asteroid. Right now, the Outer Space Treaty treats all celestial bodies the same. So that's, that meteor, that's just a cloud of dust and water, ice, that could be the size of my fist. That's a celestial body. We have to treat it the same way we treat Mars, right? I don't think that's right. I think we need to figure out a way to move a body of law into a flexible body of law into space. And again, recognize, as Camille points out, space as a place and not just as a legal regime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I jump in? Just a few thoughts that are coming to my mind.
Okay.
The presentation was so beautiful and big and with many concepts. And it's really hard to discuss everything. But okay, I will just say a few things. So what it comes to my mind, from a philosophical point of view, we are saying that planet Earth is not something different from the rest of the universe. And we start from Plato, from Dr. Marie-Louise Heuser, the head of the Space Renaissance Philosophy Laboratory, showed us that Plato was already thinking about the universe as a place with so many objects and started to think that Earth is not something different. We are part of the cosmos. And so when we come to today, that we are looking at space anymore as a distant place, no, but as a possible province for extending our civilization, expanding our civilization. Then we have to think about how we want just the moon. The moon is the first object, celestial object that we meet when we go outside. Okay, so is it another continent? the concept is very important from a philosophical point of view, because if it is another continent, we can just think about doing the same thing we are doing on Earth, on the existing already inhabited continents. On Earth, we have many problems that are not solved. Even on Earth, the problem between property and sharing is not solved, because there are many controversial concepts, and when we go to litigations in the tribunal, then the lawyers try to make jurisprudence on the cases. No, so can we really hope that we can solve this kind of problems in space when we were not able to solve them on Earth yet? So probably we will go there, taking with us the same problems and trying to solve it case by case. It's very difficult to put some rules, you know, and to say, okay, on Earth, let's not think about what we are doing on Earth, but in space we want to do so. No, it will not work. I think we will go there, and we will try to do what we can and what it will be possible to do. We will try to take profit of the resources. And you're right when you say that asteroids are different from the moon, because the moon is a word, let me say, and asteroids are more similar to repositories of raw materials. So, of course, from the legal point of view, it should be seen in different way. I very agree with that. So, what I want to say is that one thing we know, that we desperately need to start expanding. This is an obligation. Is not an option. It's like Kraft Erike said, it was extraterrestrial imperative. He said, because we have to go. 8 billion people cannot make it anymore on Earth, on one only planet. So, of course, when we start a new deal, we try to do better than what we have done until now. So it is correct to try to understand how we can do better, even because the age of the colonialism is in the past, even if colonialism is not dead, unfortunately. So we should try not to repeat the same things, no? From the point of view of go there, grab, stole things and bring back home. So all this kind of thing. We had a very big discussion in our open forum during the last 3-4 weeks, because after a newsletter that said that colonialism, no? The risk of a new space colonialism in terms of going there, taking resources and bringing them back to Earth to increase our activities on Earth. And I wrote, no, that's not the way. We have to start developing outside, because still developing on Earth will raise the pressure. And that's not what we want from the environmental point of view, from all points of view. So, okay. Many things, but we know that we have to expand, and we know that we have to do it as much as better we can, from the point of view of due respect, consideration, kindness, and all this concept that I'm very thankful to you that you reproposed this concept that I think are very much precious for us to always be in our mind and in our heart where we go ahead. Okay. I don't have questions
from
but
the chat.
Many you can mine some questions in my long comment.
Yeah, okay.
and respond.
Okay. I will go ahead with the questions from the chat. And Kamil is asking too, will the first moon bases be treated as heritage? And after being decommissioned, they can't be reused and become ghost town turned tourist attractions?
So again, my job I'm a space lawyer. My job is to make people think about what needs to be protected, and I will leave it to archaeologists and historians and anthropologists to figure out exactly what needs to be protected. But one other thing that we need to think about, and I think this is something we need to think about before we go to the moon, is again we cannot be a throwaway society on the moon. It costs a lot of money to get stuff to the moon. So I suspect that reusing is going to be a lot more important than protecting heritage. And I think that's fine. I think we need to find the balance. Should the first moon base be protected and, made into a museum? Perhaps we just think about what pieces of, how do we want to memorialize it? So one of the greatest losses from the Apollo program is they threw away all of the original computers. And they literally didn't have a lot of the information about how to go to the moon. We had to reinvent all of that. So it's not just about protecting our culture. It's about, again, looking to the future, and so we just have to be a lot smarter about how we do that. We do not want to go into space in this concept of everything is expendable. Nothing is expendable in space is the view we should take.
And here's another question. Do you think that heritage and art conservation on the moon will become an actual field of study and trade?
Absolutely.
Interesting question.
I think, well, so I see the moon as a springboard. We need to go to the moon, and we need to build bases, and we need to mine on the moon, because we don't know how to do that in space. We don't even know how to live in 1/6 gravity in space, right? We need to learn how to do all that so that we can get to everything else, so we can get to the asteroid belt, so we can get to the other planets. And so I think we will have to think of the moon as sort of our planning ground. And again, thinking about it in those terms, then we're thinking about, no, we're not just going to use up the moon and chew it out. We're going to protect it. This is our sounding ground. This is a scientific park. This is absolutely, there will be commerce involved, because scientists are going to want to buy bread that tastes better than what they make on their own regolith, right? But we need to think in terms of using the moon to get to the resources. And I see the next 100 years as this bridge, and I talked about the Polynesians, and Adriana, this sort of goes back to what you were saying is, right now, we don't have access to the infinite resources of space. We know they're out there, but we don't know how to get there. And even if we can get there, we're sort of putting along. It's going to take us hundreds of years to get to someplace, right? But the way technology has been advancing since World War II has been astounding. So we are going to get there. We just have to, our laws and ethics just have to hold together long enough for us to obtain those resources, to have the reach for those resources, because fundamentally that's what we fight about here on Earth, is the resources. So if we actually get to a point where they are infinite, then we will have less reason to fight.
Here's another question from Michael Markowski. He's saying, with a proliferation and mega constellations in low Earth orbit, the dark night sky and astronomy is threatened. And the operators of these satellites continue to develop these constellations. There are no consequences for their actions. If we cannot control the heritage of the night sky, how can we control the same issue on the moon? Interesting question.
Very interesting question, and a really important one. And I've been really the concept of protecting the dark and quiet skies from a cultural heritage standpoint has been brought up in the United Nations several times at the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And it's been really interesting to see, and very heartening, that among the reasons, it's not just about being able to see, it's not just about planetary defense, but it's about being able to see the same night sky that our grandparents and their grandparents saw. And so that this is part of that balance, right? We didn't tell Egypt that they couldn't build the Aswan High Dam. We figured out a way around it. I know that, and I've worked on working groups here in the United States to talk about this issue. And already for example, SpaceX has done a lot to try and alleviate the problems. So, yeah, correct. There's no regulation saying you cannot at this point, and we are looking at a point where I think there was just a license for 80,000 small satellites from Rwanda. So this is an issue that we have to deal with. But the good news is that people are talking about it, and we are a long way from getting way too many satellites. But don't forget that those satellites provide a benefit as well. And so we don't want to tell a rural community in South America that they can't have access to the internet because we want our, an indigenous group in North America to be able to see the night sky. So the important thing is the balance and to talk about it. And neither side should be given free rein.
Okay, in this case, I have to add that from the quantity of satellites resides the space debris, and still there is no solution for this. Who has to bring it back, and how do we bring it back if it is destroyed and you have nanoparticles, but they are still destroying,
Absolutely, and that is a really great point. There's no law against having an ASAT test and shooting down your own satellite, and that is our biggest debris fields have been caused by Russian and Chinese ASAT tests, and they're perfectly legal. This is a problem. This is something we have to change.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. I have can you hear me still? Because I have an unstable internet connection here. Denis Afonso Ribeiro is asking, Antarctica, can it be considered a continent? What would be the legal implications of considering the moon a continent? And what are the legal implications of the 94% submerged continent of Sealandia?
So the legal consequences of calling the moon a continent suggests to me that we are projecting and saying, okay, this is now part of Earth. So if this is part of Earth, then it's not part of space. If it's not part of space, then you can claim territory on it. So I think considering the moon, like officially calling it a continent, opens it up to that wild, wild west that nobody wants to see. Yes. Then it will. There was no question. It's whoever gets there first, puts down that flag, fences out their patch. That's theirs, because that's the way we've done it on Earth. If we were to literally call, and what would be the benefits? Well, then maybe international environmental laws would apply. But fundamentally, we have two very different regimes between Earth and the whole of the rest of space. On Earth, we have a sovereign paradigm where we own property, and every nation has its boundaries. In space, nobody can claim sovereignty. And so by blurring that line and calling the moon a continent, I think would have caused grave dangers in terms of how nations then implement activities on the moon.
And I would like to ask Bernard if you have a question, because Bernard will spend the time after work, his retirement time on the moon. He will retire on the moon. The question is, is it possible to buy some? Yeah.
So I think it's a very good point that you made, Michel, about the legal implication. We call the moon as a continent because it used to be, as you know, in the past history of the Earth, the moon was formed as a result of a giant impact of the Earth. So the moon has a bit of part of the Earth in it. But clearly the legal implication would be, yes, they are. On the other hand, what I think also that besides the legal implication, I have always felt that we are part of space. You know, you just have to lay down in the summer and look at the sky and say, we are really on a spaceship and we are in space. And so, but I agree, it's important to keep this law of outer space because it's much more protective of what is out there. But on the other hand, also, we have to also spread the fact that we are part of space. Our chemical element come from space. Our fate was determined by space. Our future includes outer space. But it's also important to be very careful about the legal implication, because that's the part when you say, for instance, space is like an ocean and the moon is the first island on the way. It's a nice analogy, but we don't want to have the same law as for ocean. So clearly, I think that very much appreciated the fact you say that we have to be protective. We have to protect also our human heritage. We have also to take maybe even a step further, because we are not the only species here. We have also a role as human to be a good steward of biodiversity and manage well our planet. And also when we do our journey towards space, to find how we can bring life from Earth to the moon, for instance, and to be a good protector of life that you have on Earth, even in case that we would have a huge catastrophe on Earth, we have to be prepared. And so I like also this image that, we have a very special Earth-Moon planetary system. And we have to find how to we make best use of this situation, which is very special in the galaxy, to the advantage of humanity, but also of all species on Earth.
We occupy a very special place in the cosmos.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Michel. Really, it was an amazing lecture, and you promise us to come back for another lecture.
Anytime, I can talk a lot. So
yes, I like to listen to you, and you have so many things to talk to us. So yeah, it is really an interesting topic, and I'm so glad that you were here today. And thank you again for being with us. I changed my background because it's lunar hot and on the moon. And 3 days, on the 20th of July, we have the International Moon Day, and although Bernard, he disappeared.
Flipped his camera.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I did something wrong.
You see all your stuff. And, I would like to thank also our audience to join us all the time and to listen to our lecture, and remind everyone we are a non-profit organization. We are all working as volunteers here, Adriano, Bernard, and myself, and Michel was doing it volunteer way. And so support us. You can join us. We always need new members or people who support us. And our next webinar will be on the 7th of August, and the speaker is still not confirmed. So have a look, stay tuned, and watch at our Facebook pages and our social media and our homepage, and so we'll find it out.
But the 21st of August is confirmed. Is Seth Shostak from the SETI Institute, and he will talk about science looking for aliens. So
yes,
it'll be a very interesting topic too. So we are not sure the 7th of August, but 21st of August, it is already confirmed with Seth Shostak. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
and
much.
have a good International Moon Day then. Huh? Let's celebrate all.
Yes, we celebrate it all, and I wish you all a nice evening. Thank you for joining us.
And keep on following the 18 SDG, because we are going to New York the 15th of September to hold a panel in presence and partially present, partially virtual. We are still organizing, but we will share more information in the next days and weeks. Okay.
Okay,
Okay, thank
Ad
you.
Astra.
Bye.